Japan. We'll start in 1 minute. Just a few things. I'm Robert Dujarric from TUJ. If you didn't get an email directly from us, send us your business card and we'll add you to the list. Also, as you know, these events are free, but they're not cost-free. So you're always encouraged to donate. We have our ballot boxes and the gentleman with tattoos to advise you on how much to donate will arrive later. Please welcome them. They're very nice. Brevity is a soul of wit, so just, I'm extremely happy to have Jenny Lin. You've all read the CV. I'm not going to do the standard thing, just spend 10 minutes explaining to you who she is, because you came to hear her, not me, because me you always hear anyhow. So Jenny, the floor is yours. So, the floor is yours.
Yes. I started chatting with a Dartmouth parent.
Oh, okay.
You caught me off guard.
Here it is. 1930, we're in Japan. We start on time.
I was waiting for you to go through the whole CV.
Yeah, I would, yeah. No, I would.
Thank you so much, Robert. And as usual in Japan, everything's 3 feet shorter than it needs to be. Thank you all for coming out so much. This is always a pleasure to speak at Temple because Robert is a guy who just is a magnet for interesting people and interesting discussions.
You are the magnet. They came to listen to you, not to me.
So I really appreciate the invitation, and I really appreciate you all coming out on a rainy night. So I want to talk about the U.S.-Japan alliance and a debate in Japan that needs to be had, but is not currently being had. In debates about the U.S.-Japan alliance, what we're seeing is people talking about issues related to the U.S. credibility and U.S. intentions. So will the United States stand and fight with Japan over the Senkaku Islands? Are Americans starting to care more about China? Is the U.S. really pivoting? So when asked these questions, U.S. foreign policy officials constantly assure Tokyo, we're here for you. We'll stand by you. We're really pivoting. The good news for Japan is this is true. The U.S. will is strong. The U.S. is deeply invested in East Asia, and it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. There's broad agreement in the U.S. national security community that East Asia is a vital region, and that the partnership with Japan is one of America's most important partnerships. But the bad news for Japan is this is the wrong conversation to be having about the alliance. And the issue of U.S. intentions and credibility is very important, but there's an even more important challenge at hand. And namely, the biggest challenge for the U.S. and Japan in the future is how the alliance will address a growing capabilities gap with China. Japan must first come to terms with the trend line that it's on, and must ask itself some tough questions about whether or not it's prepared to take the necessary steps to close the capabilities gap. Now, the current numbers, if you look at all the statistics about relative power, the current numbers would seem pretty reassuring. The U.S., after all, boasts a GDP of $16 trillion compared to China's GDP of about $9 trillion. And furthermore, the U.S. spends more than the other countries put together on defense, approximately 40% of the world's total, or a massive $600 billion. By comparison, China spends a lot less on its military. It's hard to know exactly how much. The Ministry of Defense publishes budgets about $120 billion. The Pentagon estimates that China spends about $150 billion, and SIPRI, a Swedish defense think tank, estimates that it's more like $190 billion. But overall, according to these current estimates, things would seem to be looking pretty good for the U.S.-Japan alliance. These numbers, however, are much bleaker than they would seem. So first, the United States is, of course, a global superpower, meaning that its defense dollars are spread out across the different regions that it seeks to influence. For the most part, this would mean 3 regions where it maintains the capabilities for major military interventions, East Asia, the Persian Gulf, and Europe. In other words, America may spend $600 billion on defense, but East Asia doesn't see all of that. So imagine that America's defense spending is divided across these three regions. This means East Asia gets around $200 billion. Now, Japan spends about $50 billion on defense. So if you look at blue here, that's the US 200 plus Japan, light blue, 50. So the US-Japan alliance generate about $250 billion of defense capability. And in the red here is China, where the solid red is the official defense budget, and the striped part is what we think is to be added on past the official statistics. So the takeaway here is that $250 billion looks a whole lot closer to Chinese current defense spending, and that China is already generating more military capability and overtaking the alliance faster than most people would generally believe. So secondly, these numbers will likely get even bleaker in the future. In terms of aggregate GDP, China has already surpassed Japan and is on track to overtake the United States. Of course, the Chinese economy is not going to grow as it has previously. The growth has already begun to slow. The economists remind us that growth slows even more at higher levels of per capita income, and that China's demographic dividend is coming to an end. China experts talk about numerous challenges that the country is facing: the burden of a social safety net, the need for environmental cleanup, and problems related to the debt burden that can be expected to slow future growth. But that said, even if China's growth slows from the level of 9%, growth in the range of 4 to 7% is still blazing. Not to mention that this growth will accrue on the base of the world's second largest economy. So even accounting for this slowdown in growth that we expect, the economists, Goldman Sachs, several other forecasters expect that China will overtake the US GDP in terms of aggregate GDP during the 2020s. So let me talk through an estimate for the future. So I want to be really clear about the assumptions I'm making, because as you all know, you can make any estimate you want based on whatever assumptions you choose. So first of all, let's start with the US. So we can expect that the US defense budget will stay pretty flat at about $600 billion. This is mandated by the 2011 Budget Control Act. And as noted, we'll say that East Asia will continue to see about a third of that, or about $200 billion. And as for Japan in this notional future, I've been very generous here. I've said that Japan's economy will grow at about 1%, and that Japan currently expects to spend about 1% of GDP on defense, as it has been doing for decades. Now for China, so I've done two estimates, one at just 7% growth per year, and the other estimate in which we see economic growth slow gradually from 7% down to 6%, down to 5%. And I assume that China will devote about 2% of its GDP to military spending, which is basically what it's doing now. So taken together, these assumptions, which are, as I said, rather conservative, show a looming capabilities gap between China on the one hand and the US-Japan alliance on the other. Now, again, this graph assumes that only about $200 billion of the U.S. defense budget would be available for East Asia. And so this is a big assumption that's going to have a big impact on just how large a gap there is, right? So here we see kind of another picture of the range of how much we can expect might be possible that the U.S. might be devoting to East Asia. So it might be more than $200 billion. It also, however, might be less. So if there's a significant conflict in the Middle East that draws the U.S. attention back to that region, perhaps East Asia will see even less than the $200 billion that I've estimated. So if this occurs, so if we do see Chinese capabilities outpacing that of the U.S.-Japan alliance, this suggests that the U.S. and Japan must either accept Chinese dominance in the Asia-Pacific or somehow have to generate billions of dollars of additional military expenditure beyond what either of them is currently planning to spend. Now, unsurprisingly, the rise of China has already fueled fears in Tokyo that the United States will be unwilling to fulfill its alliance commitments. Tokyo has been asking, will the Americans come? But that's the wrong question. The question is, can they? And what is Japan prepared to do if they can't? Now, before discussing how Japan might address this, it's important to note that there are a whole host of what-ifs that are in this whole scenario that could prevent this gap from actually emerging. And a first set of what-ifs relate to China's performance. So any number of developments could make China fall off the current trend line. Sorry. These days, the cottage industry is very busily debating how big will be the Chinese contraction. So just how much will China's growth fall? Or even will the economy collapse? So these are the things that everyone has very strong opinions on these days. Economists warn that the Chinese economy could stagnate because of a debt crisis, or perhaps because of Beijing's failure to deal with the bloat of state-owned enterprises. Alternatively, we could see China fall off this trend line because of a political crisis, as opposed to an economic one. So increasingly frequent anti-government protests in China could lead to major political upheaval in Beijing. If such turmoil produced a Chinese government that had generally benign views toward Japan, or if this change led China to turn into a giant failed state, either one of these would change the game in East Asia dramatically. Now, a second set of what-ifs relates to the US. So assuming, again, that China actually does manage to grow at this level of 5 to 7% growth, what if the US is able to devote more capabilities to East Asia? Perhaps the US will grow less distracted. Democracy and peace could spread across the Persian Gulf. America may tire of Europe, or along with the Europeans, may fashion a peaceful accommodation between NATO and Russia. Such developments would free up American resources that then could be devoted to East Asia to address the capabilities gap. The US could really and truly pivot. It could take that $600 billion of defense dollars and allocate more of it, so $300, $400 billion, to address the capabilities gap with China. There's a third set of what-ifs, namely, what if other countries who are also alarmed about increased Chinese aggressiveness and its territorial claims, what if they can help? So the Abe government has been enthusiastically reaching out to Australia, to India, and to Southeast Asian countries. Abe had a very successful visit to Australia earlier this year. At Shangri-La, he spoke to India's Prime Minister Modi about increasing bilateral security ties. And furthermore, Abe has visited all 10 ASEAN countries and has discussed shared security interests. So this is all good, right? We like this. This is good. This makes sense. Closer diplomatic and security ties between Japan and Southeast Asian countries, Japan and Australia, Japan and India, is a good thing and should be pursued. But none of this should be mistaken as a solution for the capabilities gap. Even if Australia or Vietnam or the Philippines promise to stand by Japan's side in a crisis, which again is highly debatable, those countries are very small, have small GDPs with small military budgets, and therefore lack the military capability to affect the military balance of power in any meaningful way. Now, what about the United States? Well, it's likely to be just as distracted in the future. It remains busy in Europe, which used to be the stable region. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine no longer is, of course. The US continues to be tied up in the Persian Gulf, and indeed in that region, in the wake of the Arab Spring, is less stable rather than more. In fact, in that region, in the event of conflict with Iran, for example, this could draw in more US resources away from East Asia, so that Asia sees even less of the $200 billion estimate than I assumed. So Japan should thus not count on additional American capabilities being available. Now, as for the future of the Chinese economy, the big what if about the Chinese economy, here we must acknowledge tremendous uncertainty. No forecasting should be attempted without a healthy dose of humility that we just don't know what the future is going to bring. But once again, this prediction, this estimate, the capabilities gap, was made already accounting for a profound slowdown in Chinese growth using rather conservative assumptions. The future could actually look far worse from Japan's perspective. And most importantly, the hope that some catastrophe is going to befall China or befall the CCP is not exactly the best basis for a national security policy. Therefore, this future is not inevitable, but it should be deeply concerning for Japan. If China's economy performs modestly well over the next few decades and China continues to modernize its military, Chinese military power will dominate that of the US-Japan alliance in East Asia. Now currently, when people talk about national security policy in Japan, they are not having this conversation. The first step is that Japan needs to come to grips with this trend line. Again, it's not an inevitable trend line, but it is a very possible trend line that Japan is on. So Japan is moving next to a rising great power, which is building a great power military, and is increasingly using that military to menace countries with which it has territorial disputes. Now, Tokyo will complain that their poor bilateral relations are the fault of the Chinese Communist Party, who are just stoking up anti-Japanese animosity because it needs domestic legitimacy. Beijing, of course, will blame Tokyo for their bad relations. But the bottom line is, Japan is living next to a rising, hostile superpower whose capabilities are on track to outpace those of it and its closest ally. So once Japan has come to terms with this trend line, it needs to have a serious domestic conversation about how to respond to it. So smart Japanese will disagree. They'll disagree about the probabilities of the what-ifs occurring. They'll disagree about how quickly the capabilities gap is widening. And they'll disagree, of course, about the right ways to respond to it. In the early years of the Cold War in Europe, NATO also faced a profound capabilities gap in terms of its conventional military capabilities with the Warsaw Pact. At that time, West Germany perceived a serious security threat from the Soviet Union, and the West Germans responded to this threat by building the most powerful military in the world next to that of the two superpowers. In Japan, many conservatives will say that to respond to the Chinese challenge, Japan must do the same. They will argue that Japan has to spend far more on defense, develop greater military capabilities, and create the institutional foundations to, if necessary, wield those forces. This is the direction that Prime Minister Abe is attempting to push the country. Abe has not called for significant changes in defense spending, but with the state secrecy law and the reinterpretation of the Constitution in the area of collective self-defense, he started to lay the institutional foundation for a more militarily active Japan. Now, other Japanese will oppose such an effort and will argue that Japan must not increase its military capabilities. The left will say Japan must not deviate from the highly restrained national security strategy it adopted in the aftermath of the Second World War. Pacifists will argue that Japan has to keep intact those constitutional constraints. Constitutional constraints that, except under very narrow conditions, prevent Japan's military from being dispatched overseas. Other Japanese may say Japan shouldn't increase its military spending because it has too many domestic challenges at home. It has too much debt, too many burdens associated with an aging society, and so forth. So indeed, as we know, Japan's society is aging dramatically, and an older society means less wealth and more claims on that wealth. So as the Japanese debate the capabilities gap in East Asia, they may conclude that they do not want to do more militarily, either because they're committed to maintaining the country's extreme national security restraint, or because they value domestic needs more highly. Such a decision, for either reason, would be a perfectly valid choice for the Japanese people. But a couple of points are worth making here. First, regarding Japan's pacifist values, it's clear from the West German case that the development of military power is not necessarily inimical to a commitment to peace. West Germany built the world's third largest military during the Cold War without sacrificing its commitment to its pacifist values. And second, regarding Japan's demographic and other burdens, it's important to distinguish what Tokyo can't do from what Tokyo doesn't want to do. Far poorer countries than Japan that feel threatened find a way, at the expense of other things they'd rather spend money on, to build strong military forces. Japan is wealthy. Japan is the third richest country in the world. Japan has lots of old people. South Korea has old people too. Israel has old people too. So other countries that would rather spend their money on other things figure out how to build the military forces that they need in order to make themselves safer. So the Japanese people must also be clear that given this trend line, holding the current line on defense may bring some serious costs. Basically, it means that Japan, again, assuming that this capabilities gap occurs, it means that Japan could be living in the shadow of a militarily dominant hostile China. A dominant Beijing is likely to use every tool of statecraft at its disposal to coerce, intimidate, and punish Tokyo for behavior that Beijing dislikes and to advance China's territorial claims. This could be a very unpleasant region for Japan to live in. Now, ultimately, there is no right answer here. I'm not standing here and telling Japan what it should do, although my government might like that. The point of this is to start a conversation that the Japanese people will decide how they want to proceed. The only serious mistake for Japan would be to ignore the trends, to not have this debate, and to ignore the consequences of the choices that it is currently making. Let me say a final word about burden sharing. For the past half century, the US has been urging Tokyo to play a more active role in the alliance's defense, in regional security. Washington urged Japan to spend more on defense and to contribute more capabilities to the US-Japan alliance. So one might be tempted to hear my talk and say, oh, this is another round of American calls for burden sharing. That would be a mistake. The situation facing the US-Japan alliance in the future is very different than the one we faced during the Cold War. Back then, the US and Japan economically dominated the adversary. At its peak, the Soviet Union never had more than 40% of the US GDP, let alone the combined GDP of the US and Japan, who was the second richest power in the world. The situation for the US-Japan alliance during the Cold War was, well, we're vastly richer than the adversary. Which one of us is going to come up with the defense dollars to contain it? We're in a different world today. That is not the world we're living in. China has already surpassed Japan in GDP and is on track to surpass the United States. As China adds billions of dollars to its defense budget every year, its capabilities are likely to outpace those of the US-Japan alliance. For Japan, understanding the trend line that it's on and debating whether and how to respond to it is the real national security debate that it needs to have. Thank you very much. Your pictures better be as pretty as
it's actually okay. So, unfortunately, I agree with most of what Jenny said, which is too bad because this will be more of a debate. We'll have one where two people really disagree in a few weeks. I think one thing, of course, in this idea of a capabilities gap in the future, you're very much right about the fact it's very, very difficult to predict the future. And I mean, I remember listening to one of the top experts on the Soviet Union saying in 1989 that it was conceivable the Soviet Empire would collapse anyway. And that was actually, I thought at the time, very risky. Very few people even said that. And I think, I won't go into it in depth, I think if you look at China, China has enormous weaknesses, even if it continues to grow. I think the important thing to understand about the defense debate here, that we alluded to, is Japanese voters don't care about this. And I think we tend, most of us here obviously are interested in defense, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But these are two opinion polls I looked at. US voters, top issues for the elections: economic policy, social security, defense wasn't even there. And interestingly enough, 53% don't even approve of collective self-defense, which is, as David Pilling said, is basically saying Japan can be like Sweden. In other words, if its allies are attacked, it can decide to also participate in the war. This is another thing, the most important tasks for the cabinet: the economy, welfare, public finance, energy and nuclear power. This is civilian nuclear power, post-tsunami earthquake reconstruction, and even LDP voters only put defense and diplomacy at 16%, and 10% for the average Japanese. So even Abe's electoral base doesn't really care. So you have a country that is still very passive. This is another thing. This shows how much Japan spends. Now, spending is inputs. What matters are outputs. The problem is easier to measure inputs than outputs, so that's why we look at defense spending. As you see, the best comparison, I think, is with West Germany during the Cold War, frontline state. West Germany was at about 3% of GDP, plus it had conscription. And conscription means first you're forcing young men to spend a year plus in the armed forces, but you're also saving a lot of money because you're not paying them for this. If I want to get a soldier to join the GSI, I've got to pay him a market wage. If you have conscription, well, I just don't have to pay him because it's the law. So you have to really factor this into spending. And there are other areas in which West Germany was spending a lot more. So Japan really is not interested in this. The voters are not interested in it. And I think one reason is because so far it has worked. You know, Japan is safe. No one's died in war. US is mostly happy. And so we'll only know that it doesn't work if there is a conflict. But until there's a conflict, it's hard to refute the argument that we should spend more, because I'll say, look, you know, we're fine. I don't believe in that argument. It's an argument that's very easy to make. So I think in the end, this is what Japan is. It's a friend of mine who did this drawing for me. So this is really better than your PowerPoint. I'm very proud of it. It's a friend of mine. A lot of the discussions here, I think both supporters and enemies of Abe have painted him as a sort of wolf, a hawk, and whatever. And Jenny mentioned he's done a few things to improve the software of defense, but he doesn't seem to have any interest in really spending more. And so Japan looks like a wolf, partly because of Abe's persona, the trips to Yasukuni, all this. But if you look at how Japan responds to crisis or to challenges, I think there is no nation in the world, probably including the Vatican, that is as dovish. No, it's interesting, think of it. Chinese vessels have intruded very frequently in the Senkaku's territorial waters. Now, most Japanese believe that these are Japanese territorial waters. Whether they are is not the issue. Most Japanese citizens believe this. Has the Japanese public called for action, for maybe catching the Chinese ships, firing at the Chinese government vessels? No. If you had a continuous intrusion of, say, Cuban vessels into the Florida Keys, the American public would want something to be done. I think if you had Japanese Coast Guard vessels routinely entering the territorial waters of Tokto Takeshima, you can bet that the Korean public would want something to be done. In fact, I think the president of Korea did nothing, she would be impeached on the spot. She'd just say, well, it's unfortunate, we'll talk to our Japanese friends and we'll try to get along. And that's essentially what Japan has done. So it's very difficult to have, I think, the sort of debate that Jenny thinks is called for. And I very much agree with her that it's called for, because so far that's not how the Japanese public thinks about this. This is related, obviously, to Japan's experience in the war, to the ideological divide that characterized Japan in the 50s and 60s, and also to the way Japanese conservatism has evolved. So I think, yes, it would be great to have a debate. I'm very happy we're having this debate, but it's going to be, I think, sometime before the sheep gets not only a wolf skin, but maybe at least an armor, or something a little stronger. So I really like this sheep. So. I asked the artist for it. I mean, this is an order for $50. It's a 15-year-old. It's very, very gifted. Okay, so here it is. So questions? We have a lot of young people, I see, the students, so we should encourage the young to ask questions, because it's you who are going to join the armed forces, so it's you who are going to carry the rifles while we give you advice. So, so speak up, especially the young Japanese, before you enter the SDF. Once Jenny decides that conscription, what, 5 years? 5 years conscription at least. So.
Just a quick comment. It is on the assumption of spending. China has very few friends, and it's got borders that are quite wide. And that spending is probably just as diluted as the U.S. is in terms of three different sections. India has this on and off relationship with Russia and also itself. It has so many problems within China that Putin doesn't need this right now. It would just be a nuisance to actually point his forces on this when he's got about 5 major problems in the country. I'll just give a one-sentence answer, and then you give a one-paragraph answer. I think I would agree with it. One thing is, I don't think countries are friends. I mean, Lord Palmerston said something very profound. He said, England doesn't have friends, she has interests. And I think always, see, especially in Japan, often you see the dialogue, people friends, just Japan have friends. The question is not whether you have friends, it's whether you have allies, whether you have countries that have a reason to fight with you.
I think this is a really great question. I think you have a few questions buried in there, actually. And I think the point is especially good when it comes to India. So China's relations with India could be something that consumes a lot of its energy, depending on how that develops. China's done a really good job of settling its territorial disputes, its border disputes around its perimeter, and you can see why. For this reason, it's very useful to have those resources freed up to be used elsewhere. And of course, there's internal security, which is a major mission that the PLA is designed to fight, rather than the Japanese and Americans don't have much internal security. So we could talk about the different ways that China's military is also dominated, so to speak. With respect to China not having any friends, what I would react by saying is, thank God, because the graph I did was with China having no friends, right? And so imagine if they had friends. So I'm very pleased that China has made itself quite distasteful to so many countries in the region, such that it doesn't have people to pile on with it there, like the US and Japan very luckily have each other. So in the event that we do see China more successfully attracting allies, which I think actually is quite possible, but probably not in Asia. I think in Asia it would be more countries within its orbit, right, as opposed to adding significant military capabilities to China itself. But it's kind of countries falling into the Chinese orbit, which won't add a whole lot in the way of military capabilities. Outside of Asia, I don't know. People talk a lot about China doesn't have any soft power, China doesn't have any appeal. And I think we normally think of China as, or we normally think of soft power as being something that appeals on a people-to-people level, but soft power can also be something with respect to governments. And China's government may have a lot of appeal to governments around the world that are very tired of a very activist, very perceived as arrogant, very interventionist American government, and particularly in the Persian Gulf, where China can win a lot of hearts, frankly, by its kind of anti-interventionist policy.
Hi. I think this is the second one to raise the question. Professor Lin, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. We are very much, the Japanese academics, quite concerned about the situation and some decades in the future. We really appreciate your concern in this region. Now, in your talk, you described that the capability gap is not inevitable. However, you seem to think that the rise of China brings about the specter of military dominant and perhaps hostile giant sitting next to Japan. How can we avoid that? How can the Japanese state bring about a future that the rising nation will not be hostile, will not be militarily aggressive, will not become a fascist nation? What can we do? What should we have in our minds?
It's a great question. I really love that you're asking it too, because again, it's like we don't want to get into this, people call it the Thucydides trap, where this is this inevitable, we have a rising power, and therefore we're going to fight a war. So it's good to keep thinking, how do we stop this? How do we change this? How do we make it better? So first of all, make conflict very costly, and that's one thing that I think Japan has already done with economic interdependence, with greater business ties to China, with educational, technological exchanges. All of these things make conflict costly. Obviously, nuclear deterrence makes the threat of conflict very costly. And so this is a relationship, the U.S.-Japan alliance in the form of the American nuclear weapons, Chinese have Chinese nuclear weapons, conflict would be very costly. And we know the leaders are truly terrified of things escalating. They get it. They understand how dangerous this is and how important it is to keep relations at a civil level. And so I think that's one thing that we can certainly do, is keep relations at least at a civil level. There might not be a whole lot of love there, but there will be a shared desire to avoid conflict, both through the mechanisms of economic interdependence and through deterrence. And at least, again, we could prevent war from breaking out in this way. In terms of what Japan can do, lots of people really emphasize, oh, Japan needs to fix its history problems with China and with South Korea and others. Here, I wrote a book on this, and so we can talk about history if you want, but that wasn't the plan. It always comes back, though. Here, I think that Japan's in a situation where it could make things a little better. It could make Xi Jinping's face a little less pained during the handshake. But really, China has no incentive to take that olive branch right now, right? There's actually domestic incentives for China to keep these bad feelings going. And so I wouldn't say, oh, well then, to heck with them, let's forget all of it. There are still things that Japan can do to, honestly acknowledge its past history that will soothe its relations with countries that are interested in having smooth relations with Japan, and certainly will influence global opinion as well. I think a lot of the the statements that we've seen from Abe that confused me and lots of other people about, well, what is the government position on these issues? I think those have been quite costly for Japan in the kind of the eye of global opinion. And again, I'm not going to say this is the magic solution to making relations better between Japan and China, because I don't see that it would be. But it could certainly help smooth things, and then it would help Japan in many other ways as well.
I think when I'm asking, I think the ability of economic interdependence to prevent conflict is actually quite limited. I mean, there are lots of cases of countries that went to war against each other that actually had very close economic interaction. In fact, if you think of the wars of the Yugoslav succession, you had cases where at the same time they were killing each other, engaging in attempted genocide or genocide, and trading with each other. So you can, I'm not sure that the economic relationship between Japan and China necessarily, or between the US and China is something that slows the risk of conflict. I think to try to answer Takahara-sensei's question in the end, the core issue is USA versus China. And what Japan can do to alter that relationship is fairly limited, because the Japanese government has chosen to be a fairly junior partner to the US. I mean, it could be a bigger partner if it did more in defense in other areas, but has chosen not to. So the climate is fundamentally defined in the Sino-American relationship. And I think the history issue, I mean, in the short run, actually, Xi Jinping wants Abe to go to Yasukuni, because it hurts the relationship between Japan and South Korea, it damages Japan's image in the US, and it convinces the Chinese public that the Communist Party is right. And the reason for doing something, whatever that something is on the history issue, is not to improve relations with the Communist Party. The Communist Party in China is in power because the Japanese army defeated the Kuomintang. If there had been no Japanese invasion, it's quite possible Mao would never have come to power. But the history thing, having a better image, would help the relationship with South Korea, because both countries are democracies, and therefore they're very influenced by public opinion. And also, in a post-communist China, it's important for Japan to think of how Chinese, after the communist era, will think of Japan. So it's an investment in the future. But in the short run, the history issue is not the reason for Sino-Japanese relations being bad. I think it's actually totally irrelevant to it at this point.
Okay, spending money is one thing, but qualitatively, what's your assessment on the strength of Chinese military? How strong are they, in other words?
How strong is the Chinese? The bottom line is, with numbers that we're putting up like that, we can count on them to be rather strong by that point.
But qualitatively, spending money is easy, but qualitatively, what's your real assessment of that?
Qualitatively,
right.
Well, they're getting in the game, right? They're building the military technology that's on par with leading military powers. So you could talk about the training involved, the software is the good word that Robert used.
So you say on par. I'm surprised to hear that.
Can I talk? So the Chinese are getting in the game here. So no, they have this aircraft carrier, right? But it's going to be a long time before they can figure out how to use it, before they're going to have the planes and the training to be able to use it. So, but what I'm talking about here is a trend line of the next 25 years. And when I look at China, I see a country that was desperately poor and has made itself into a producer of very impressive technology. And lots of people would say at this point, oh, no, it just screws stuff together, it doesn't make anything, it doesn't build anything. Well, but guess what? It's learned how to build really high-tech stuff. And I have no doubt that just like the United States, which used to copy everything that the British did and learn how to do it, and the South Koreans, which used to copy everything that it imported, and then they learned how to do it. Guess what? Like Japan, which everybody said, oh, the Japanese, they just screw together stuff that other people invent. Well, look at Japan today. So I don't see any reason to believe that the Chinese are going to somehow be unable to develop the technology for this. And I certainly don't see a lack of will in China to develop the kind of military capabilities, military training to do this. So again, we're talking about a lot of ifs here. Back to the question of What kind of country do we think China is going to be? Will it be so hostile to Japan? There, it's looking pretty hostile today, but again, it's still a question depending on China's political development. So there's lots of what ifs here, but I don't see that China is going to encounter a technological hurdle that for some reason China, unlike everybody else, is going to be unable to surmount.
Thank you. I think it's a very good question. There's a military historian whose name I forgot said that one day of battle reveals more than 20 years of peacetime. So it's extremely hard to know how a military will perform when it never has. And for all practical purposes, the Chinese military hasn't since the war with Vietnam, which itself was fairly short. The one thing we do know, I think, and in that sense, that's an important thing to take into account when comparisons are made with Imperial Germany, is that if you belong to the elite of Germany before World War I, as if you were a man, that did not apply to women, you served in the armed forces as an officer. It was essential. I mean, the best and the brightest did their time serving in the military and died. I mean, if you look at World War I fatalities, unlike what's happened, say, in Afghanistan or Iraq, the top 5% were in there. In China, it seems that the children of the rich and powerful seem to prefer education in the US and Wall Street to joining the armed forces. So one interesting question is, who joins the military? Who are the officers? Where do they stand? How trained they are? But it's very, very hard to answer this question until the fighting starts.
Jenny, I wanted to ask you as well, just about in terms of, you talked about demographics, but I remember hearing the President of the Philippines, President Aquino, saying, when he was asked to comment on the Chinese dispute with the Philippines on the Spratly Islands, he said, we're not taking these guys on because for every one of us, there's 15 of them. So in Japan's case as well, of course, for every one Japanese, there's 15 Chinese, So just wondering if you could comment on that. The other question I had was on climate change. A lot of military dollars are being spent around the world in dealing with disaster relief, etc. And a lot of studies have been done on this, and China and Japan are probably front and center in terms of having to spend military dollars and defense dollars on dealing with some of these issues. And you're talking about a 25-year trajectory. I'm wondering as well if you could just comment on that, and how much money do you think that may eat up out of the 50 billion that Japan is spending?
I have no idea in terms of what percentage of defense the Japanese are diverting to this project, and if that's a comparable number with China. So what we would just ask ourselves is are those numbers comparable in both countries? And I'm guessing it's pretty small. I don't know if it's comparable or not. But if what we're seeing, it's a really interesting question, because maybe we're seeing that some countries are diverting larger percentages, and so that's obviously going to be eating away at hard military spending. And maybe some countries are diverting less of that, which would give them a certain advantage. So that's what we would want to know, and I have no idea what the answer actually is.
What about my first question? Sorry, what about demographics? 15 to 1?
I think that kind of speaks for itself, right? I mean, this is kind of the day one of international politics at Dartmouth, as we talk about, what makes a great power, and we put all these different things up on the board, and one of the things is population, right? And so this is why that's why we're all talking about the rise of China, is because of those billions of people. So it's one of the building blocks to be a great power and to have this kind of consequence in the world. And China has that. That's why we're not talking about, Finland, no disrespect to all my Finnish friends here. People matter, the population size matters. And so, and especially we can talk about a billion people in a democracy versus a billion people in an authoritarian country. I think that's even more interesting. So basically, it's one of those building blocks that makes China as dangerous as it is.
Alexander of Macedon did conquer most of the known world, starting with a small population. But of course, things were all different at the time. I think for the human disaster relief, one thing it's important to understand is that the capabilities you use for human disaster relief, also capabilities you can use in wartime. And actually, for a country like Japan, humanitarian disaster relief is a very good way to train for war, because Japan is not at war. There are political restrictions to the sort of peacekeeping operations Japan can engage in. In other words, it really has decided not to engage in really violent peacekeeping, I mean, where you really have fighting. And when you deploy for, say, a typhoon in the Philippines, well, first you have to operate with your allies in a real crisis situation. So that's very different from an exercise, and that adds a level of realism. You have to learn how to deal with countries, get basic rights or whatever. You have to put your servicemen and women under some stress, because it can be very stressful to disaster relief. If you do disaster relief in a place like Haiti, sometimes it's really dangerous because some neighborhoods in Port-au-Prince are very violent. So it's a way to approximate, not war training, but something comes a little closer to it. So it's not, you're not doing it just to help people. You're doing it as part of your activities to train for war.
Very cynical.
No, I mean, I prefer Machiavelli.
Yoshio Muto from National Security Secretariat. I basically agree your concern, share your concern. Given the current trend, there's no reason to be optimistic about the balance, about the future of China. But that said, I thought your observation to sort of divide the U.S. spending into 1/3 is a little bit simplistic. One reason is technology. The spending for technology, that does not necessarily have to be divided into 1/3. The technology that is useful in, like in Middle East, could also be used in the Asia Pacific. And also, when you think about the technology basis which China has versus the technology basis which is available for US, the same amount of spending for technology doesn't necessarily give the same level of technology to the US compared to China compared to US. And also, even if you think about the quantity, unless contingencies happen simultaneously, like Middle East and China, certain amount of forces could be diverted, like from Middle East to the Pacific. So, in that sense, also, you don't have to necessarily divide the whole spending into 1/3. So, how do you address that?
It's a really good question, and again, as I pointed out, because it's a big assumption that's built in there. If I'm saying it's 200 billion, going back to, well, I don't know how to get back to this, but to the slide where I showed the kind of blurry line. So we don't know how much the U.S. is going to be able to, contribute to East Asia exactly. It depends on political conditions. As I said, the political conditions in Europe and in the Middle East don't look particularly promising, that we can expect the U.S. to be able to focus more of its energies on East Asia. You're certainly right in terms of the U.S. spends a lot of things in its defense budget that it gets credit for, right, like military R&D, that will benefit it in all of these regions at the same time, and that sort of thing. But an important other note is of course China spends now the second largest amount in the world on military R&D, and as its GDP grows up and goes up, and its defense spending goes up, just mechanically its military R&D spending is also going to grow and will surpass that of the United States. So that's another advantage that we would expect to see. In terms, though, of I showed you the kind of shaded area there. So maybe you can say, well, the US is going to be able to focus on the Pacific to the tune of 300 billion or 400 billion. There you kind of start to wonder politically if this is sustainable. If the Japanese are saying, we care about our security to the degree of $50 billion, and we want the Americans to spend $400 billion. I don't see that working out real well. Maybe during the Cold War, when the Americans perceived Europe was the main theater and that it needed to collect alliances, but here the Japanese are far more directly threatened, and the Americans are in the other scenario here of being entrapped by the Japanese. So I don't know that we can even realistically expect, first of all, that 300, 400 billion would be available, and then we run into questions of, is that even politically sustainable? Just one other thing to mention, a lot of the questions are having this flavor of being about war. So if there's a war, so the US will be able to divert forces, and how do we know how, really good question, military effectiveness of the Chinese? How do we know if they're any good at wielding forces? These are all really good questions, and maybe we will have military engagements, but that's frankly not what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about there will even necessarily be war, and we hope that there won't be. I'm talking about China just being that 800-pound gorilla that everybody knows is going to defeat anybody that tries to come near its shores just by virtue of having the biggest military. And so a scenario where 25 years from now you have an Asia in which China is dominant, and Indonesia and South Korea and the Philippines and Vietnam are all kind of in its orbit. And in that situation, China being angry at Japan for something and saying, we don't like the fact that you do whaling, and so we're going to do a 20% tariff on all goods being shipped to Japan. So that's not a war, right? But that's a scenario in which the Chinese are dominant, and Japan's not going to be able to do anything about it. Vietnam recently, when China towed the oil rig into Vietnam's waters, couldn't do anything about it, right? So that's what I'm talking about here, which is a scenario in which China is simply the largest power in the region, where nobody has a plausible theory of how anyone might stand up to it. And so I'm not necessarily saying there's going to be war between China and Japan and the US. That could happen, but that's not a situation, that's not the only situation we should be thinking about. We should just be talking about the balance of power in the region and how it's shifting.
One clarification about the increasing Chinese power. That power will be mainly deployed to East Asia because they do not, is my understanding correctly, so as they do not have a big threat of North or West or South, or if they have some threat or in this direction or even domestically, it's my wishful thinking, but the threat to the in the East Asia Pacific, it will be lessened, so it's a good news for Japan. Then I'd like to clarify the China's potential threat and how they allocate the power.
So you're saying, will China's military get distracted elsewhere and also internally?
Yeah, that's news, but I just want to clarify.
Yeah, and this is a really good question. This we touched on earlier also, which is, so it depends, the ability of China to concentrate its forces in Asia, well already it's kind of an advantage, right, in being in East Asia and all. But the ability of it to concentrate on maritime East Asia will indeed depend on the stability of its borders, which it seems to be managing pretty well, but India's a big question. And then also internal security will remain a big issue. And then maybe we'll see China get some global ambitions also. So it might start collecting allies around the globe, which bring defense obligations for China as well. And so we could see China moving even further afield. So given the extent of the timeline that I'm talking about here, that's all developments that we could see.
I think it's a good question because it's the issue of internal security. There's also the question of China's growth has also led to increased vulnerability in the sense that Mao Zedong's China was totally autarkic. It sold very little, bought very little. So in order to hurt it, you literally had to attack it physically. China obviously now is an importer of raw materials, which makes it very dependent on various sea lanes, rail lanes, and other means of importing vital goods, and also on exports. And there's also one thing in which it's become vulnerable, which is the fact that so many of the children of the elite, and sometimes their spouses, now live in the US, ready to be interned by the US. If things get, no, I mean, it's interesting. This would be the first major conflict where if you probably took the top 10,000 people in China, a not insignificant number of them have children who reside in the United States or in NATO allies or in Japan. I think it would be naive to think that if things got very bad, the US wouldn't intern them. Not, you can't just, I mean, they're very rich, so they can stay at the Ritz-Carlton. No, I mean, look, when a war starts, it's standard to intern enemy aliens. That's what's always been done. So that's another aspect of vulnerability that I think few people have thought about.
There's some hands.
Yeah, I was actually going to volunteer to be interned, actually.
You have to pay. Because they richly pay themselves.
I thought Temple was going to pay for me.
It's very poor, so
right.
capsule hotel for you.
Oh,
You might
yeah.
get a calendar if you get.
Well, I'll be depending on the charity of the British Embassy, which means I'll get a tent. The British Embassy representative. Annoying anyone. Yeah, I just want to pick up a few points. I'll try and be brief. I agree with what you said about balance of power, that we've been focusing, looking at military stuff. People like me do tend to become rather gunji otaku, I don't even know how to say it in English, military nerdish about these things. I do, naturally. But I think there is a danger of talking about balance of power in this respect. I do look at your assumptions and you put conditions on them. One thing that I think you are obviously aware of is the incredible dynamism of the US. 600 million is not the only aspect of US power. The dynamism of the US civil society, as well as its military capacity, is extraordinary. And yes, the 800-pound gorilla in the corner of the room is the US, because if you are a middle power allied to the US, it's actually tricky being a US ally. But the sense of balance of power with the US, it isn't just that 600 million or one particular tranche of it. It is the totality. And the deterrent value of that totality is incredible. So I would say that. I also agree with you that focusing overly on military aspects is somewhat worrying, in the sense that we then project looking at conflict, and whereas we should be looking at conflict prevention. We should really be looking, even Gunji Otaku like me, should be looking at peace and pacifism and the joys of staying in a hotel while interned, rather than fighting over the Senkaku. Talking about fighting over the Senkaku though, because I am a Gunji Otaku, a few questions have been raised, and Robert picked up a point on the efficacy of armed forces. And I would like to add two things on that. One is, Robert, I agree with you completely. Slightly less cynicism, but operations, any operations, help to improve the efficiency and efficacy of armed forces, whether it's for the UN or unilateral or multilateral, whatever. It helps. The Chinese have increased their participation in UNPKO and other operations, but not integrated to the degree that other countries often are, particularly South Asian countries. Another aspect is the reputation of the efficacy of your armed forces can be very, very brittle. I do speak as a British person, and the British in Afghanistan and Iraq have been monumentally unsuccessful, despite the fact that their armed forces are very well respected. I mean, astonishingly poor in dealing with these difficult situations. So efficacy of armed forces is a very difficult thing to assess. It is something that armed forces need to constantly work on. And my final point, I will shut up, is about Abe. And I like the work you did, I like this, but I like the work you did before on the history issues, because that's what I really love. It seems to me that Abe and his party are probably the best equipped to reassess Japan's defense and change the direction, but they are monumentally the worst equipped to actually enact this and to actually produce the result that Japan wants, because they simply are not trusted. You raised the point about what is Abe saying, what does he want? Really, what motivates the man and the people around him? And I think that because there is such a lack of trust, whatever changes he were to put forward in defense, despite the Japanese people's opinions, it would not produce the effect that he would wish to have. Sorry, I haven't had a shut down.
I have no idea what to respond to. On the last point, which is most fresh in my memory, I raised the comparison with West Germany in the Cold War and how it was threatened by the Soviet threat, and so it built up its military capabilities despite having this newly created pacifism at the time. I actually think that I've been talking to a lot of people about the West German case when it comes to historical issues also. Not necessarily that Japan should apologize all the time, as you know if you've read my work apparently, but the fact that as the West Germans were building up their military, obviously there was this tremendous reservoir of distrust toward the Germans and anything approaching the military at that time. And so West German conservatives, they understood that they had to comport themselves in a certain way. Otherwise, people would be deeply alarmed to see that the Germans were building up such an impressive military. And also the West Germans had this other burden, this added burden of they wanted to reunify someday. So basically, you saw this kind of astonishing restraint on the part of West German conservatives when it came to history issues. Because conservatives generally, they react like Abe, right? They say, you know, we don't want to spend a whole lot of time focusing on the bad things of the past. Abe's got his grandfather in there as well to add even more motivation for that. They say, you know, we want Utsukushi no Kuni, you know, we're a beautiful country, we want to emphasize the positive aspects of our past. If anyone thinks that Japan is remotely unusual in this, please go read Lynn Cheney's children's book in the US, F is for flag, and the fathers who waved it, or something like that. I mean, it's very patriotic. It's designed to instill strong patriotism and national pride in American children. This is what conservatives tend to think is important for national security, for national identity, for national cohesion, for patriotism. And so I think Abe is very much cut from that cloth. But as I said, when you're dealing with a situation of so much distrust like the West Germans had in the 1950s, they understood they couldn't do the normal flag-waving stuff where they talked about like, well, you know, Hitler was a good idea gone wrong, and, you know, you can't say those things. So they kind of got the message. They didn't like it, but they kept their mouths shut. And occasionally they would speak up, and that's when you would see some of these debates rear their heads with the French and with others at the time. So what I think that case is an example where you had a highly motivated West German conservatives, again, to keep their mouths shut because of their national security goals. And so what I've been talking about to people here is, if you want to build up your military, this is perhaps a useful case for you to think about the restraint that even though you have these deeply held conservative beliefs, and even though you're right, it is not fair, you know, that Americans can say these things and you're not allowed to, that British can say these things, that French can say these things, that Turkish can say these things and you're not allowed to. But that it's something that will help in this situation where you do have distrust, but where you perceive you have a need to build up military capabilities to make yourself safer. The question is, how do you make that palatable to outside observers?
Two things, thanks. One was a difference is that in Japan, the rulers in the late 30s and in the early 40s were essentially conservatives, conservative army officers who would crush the more radical elements, and conservative establishment types like Kishi. In Germany, Hitler was a revolutionary. He was a national socialist. He hated the Army Officer Corps. That's why he created, among other things, the Waffen-SS, the new army. He is the first German leader who crushed the power of the army, who established civilian control. He hanged army officers after the July 20th plot. So he, conservative politicians, I mean, regular conservatives were very much in his sights, not as much, obviously, as the Jews who were victims of the Holocaust, or as some left-wing politicians. So it's different because Hitler had been the enemy of every conservative. Abe is the grandfather of Kishi, and very few Japanese conservatives, even those who opposed the regime, were subjected to the same sort of persecution as a lot of German right-wing conservatives who were against the system. And there was no July plot here. They couldn't have been a July plot since the army was already in power. So it's very different. I think on civil society, you're totally right. And then one reason I alluded to Xi Jinping's daughter, I think now she's left Harvard, she's back, so she won't be interned, is this is an interesting case of a country that is politically opposed to the US, there's no doubt about it, but still thinks that its children have to be educated there. That US universities have to go to China. Now that doesn't mean they like the US politically, but it's a very different thing that you didn't see at the height of the Mao era. The Maoists believed that they were right and that they had really very little to learn from the capitalists. Now it's kind of changed, and that's obviously an aspect of US power that often we don't think about.
In comparison to the way discussions are evolved, I think the two questions I had in mind seems much simpler. One question on Senkaku and another question on Okinawa. On Senkaku, since September 2012, I have been trying to tell my audience in Japan that we cannot accept China's entry into the territorial waters. And I am saying exactly the same thing which Robert said. I'm questioning them. If we had done the same thing to Northern Territories or the Takeshima, what would they have done? Our ships will be shut down. And why are we not shooting them? Then dead silence. And as Robert said, you know, there is no rising antipathy towards China because of this. And I think you have very eloquently proved that Xi Jinping has very little reason to change the present-day situation. But then, what is happening now? It is continuation of the derogation of Japanese sovereignty, and it is very dangerous. And all Chinese interlocutors that I know maintain that we now might continue the status quo. But what is status quo? It is present-day status quo. And I'm trying to tell them that that can never be accepted by Japan. And my question, is there not a way somehow to change this situation? Because this present situation is really not in the interest of Japan. And in the long run, I don't think it's in the interest of China. In the sort of tip I'm trying to float is a status quo which existed between 1972 and 2012. And then the discussion ends. But do you have any hint or advice for us to change the situation? Second question on Okinawa. Because this is one issue, I think, which may be in a real difficulty between in our alliance. And I think today, a very unfortunate event happened in Washington. You may know that President Obama was asked about the present-day racial situation in the United States, and he quoted his experience in visiting Japan. And he said that Japan is a country where relatively it's a single people nation. But you know, but how would the Okinawans will listen to this? It's devastating. And there is outcome of the election. Will this issue not become a real difficulty in our alliance? Easy question.
Will the issue of President Obama's statement?
No, well, not necessarily. Okinawa, outcome of election and Denmark and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So my understanding of Okinawa is that Tokyo is very deeply committed to this Futenma deal going forward, and so it's going to do everything it possibly can. And so what we're seeing with the recent election in Okinawa is that it's just gotten that much harder for it to achieve this goal. But Tokyo's planning on making this happen. I'm not sure how they're going to do it, but they're deeply concerned about this, and they want this to go through. There's all sorts of very heavy-handed ways that they could do this. They could, there's this land reclamation law in Okinawa where the governor has to give his approval for the land reclamation and this sort of thing. Tokyo could change the law, right? They could pass a new law. So there's all sorts of rather heavy-handed things that Tokyo could do to make this happen. I hope it doesn't come to that, because that would be seen as so anti-democratic to see the wishes and desires of the Okinawan people being ignored in that fashion. So that would be, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is this all about, and is it worth this? But the bottom line is, Tokyo wants this to go forward. Every person I've spoken to in the government here is, their chin is set, they are ready for battle, and they want this to happen. But you're right, it's gotten a whole lot harder. On the Senkaku, after the Chinese proclaimed this air defense identification zone, I guess it was last winter, I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs where I discussed this issue. And basically I talked about that we should be trying to distinguish symbolic changes from changes in the status quo, meaningful changes in the status quo that the Chinese are trying to enact with respect to the islands. So as an American whose country is on the hook for a war, if this goes bad, I have to say I'm very glad that the Japanese have not been shooting at Chinese vessels, because one of my other papers is on the potential for crisis escalation if just such a scenario happens. And it's all too easy to not only point to the escalatory pressures that would happen to make a limited crisis, a limited military crisis, widen into a wider war, but also the nuclear escalation potential that could happen here. And again, let's take a step back, folks. We're talking about the Senkaku Islands. Do we want to trade Beijing and Boston? This is kind of getting into the realm of the absurd. So I'm glad the Japanese are not shooting at the Chinese vessels. And I think that actually the restraint is very good in terms of if they're just cruising around the area, or if they're doing symbolic things rather than as distinguished from meaningfully different things. And let me give a couple examples. So if the Chinese are interfering with Japan's ownership of the islands in ways that prevent Japan from enjoying ownership, so if the Chinese are towing an oil rig there and extracting resources from the area, that is a meaningful change in the status quo. That is the Chinese saying, we are consuming these resources, you are not. That has to be dealt with. I don't know what the right tool is. I don't recommend opening fire straight off. Back to maybe we can look for more peaceful solutions here. If the Chinese land forces on the islands, if they start building structures on the islands, these are all interfering with Japan's ability and ownership, ability to consume the benefits of ownership of these islands. So I strongly believe that we should not look at small symbolic changes and say, aha, it's time to take that stand. But we should distinguish between, is it symbolic or is it a meaningful change? Again, my country's on the hook for fighting that war, so I have an incentive here to avoid that war. And I'm guessing that many Japanese feel the same way.
One word there.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Briefly.
Yeah. I think I have to disagree with you. It's very serious because entering into the territorial waters already crosses the red line. But I'm not saying that we should shoot at it immediately. I'm not saying this. But the present day situation has to be changed. That is my view. But how? This is difficult.
But you give pursuit and you give warnings and all of that, right?
No.
So
We have to stop Chinese vessels to enter. That is. Yeah, no. So this is I'm asking.
Okay, I mean, one issue of it, I think what you say is that the question is that even if it's only symbolic,